Welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio, exploring the frontiers of spirituality, consciousness, the esoteric, and humanity's sacred relationship with the living earth. I'm your host, Nick Mather, and in this episode, I speak with Dr. Sharon Coggan, recently retired professor and founder of the Religious Studies program at the University of Colorado in Denver. She is also the author of Sacred Disobedience, a Jungian analysis of the Saga of Pan and the Devil. In our discussion, Sharon introduces us to the Greek god Pan and the universe of meaning inherent in the archetypal complex of this ornery, rebellious, and joyful god of nature. Dr. Coggan also discusses Jung's theory of consciousness with a special focus on the concept of the shadow. Dr. Sharon Coggan holds a bachelor's degree in religious studies from the University of Denver, a Master of Theological Studies from Harvard Divinity School, an MA from Stanford University, and a PhD from Syracuse University. She recently retired from the University of Colorado in Denver, where she founded the Religious Studies program and served as director for many years. She was a beloved professor teaching courses on myth and symbol, classical mythology, world religions, mysticism, concepts of the soul, and differing concepts of the divine. Her areas of study include history of religion and psychology of religion. She also serves on the board of directors of the C.G. Jung Society of Colorado. Sacred Disobedience is her first book. Dr. Sharon Coggan, welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio.
Thanks so much. So glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm very happy to be speaking with you today. And I first wanted to congratulate you on your book.
Thank you.
I know that this was a labor of love for you, and it shows. It's beautifully written, and I think it's a very accessible book, accessible to non-academic audiences. So I want to encourage everyone to pick up a copy of it. I think you have some very important things to say in the book.
Thank you.
So we have a lot of ground to cover in sort of unpacking this. And I thought that maybe the best place to begin is to look at Pan, because that's what the book is. It's a Jungian analysis of the Saga of Pan and the Devil. And I imagine that most people are somewhat familiar with the Greek god Pan, but I thought I would ask you to go in a little bit about who Pan was.
Okay. All right. So Pan was an ancient deity of Greece, and he came from Arcadia, which is this very remote area in the central Peloponnese in Greece. And it was known as a kind of cultural backwater. You know, it's in the Greek imagination, it was a primal place. There weren't even any great cities across the whole of Arcadia. So Pan emerges as that's his home territory, kind of a forbidden, mountainous, rocky place. You know, an uncivilized place. And so this gave a quality to his character. And he was the goat god. Now I have a picture of him, a statue of him on the cover of my book. If you glance at it quickly, you might think, oh my God, it's the devil. No, it's Pan. So I'm arguing, I'm not the only one to point this out. I have a long footnote in which I name all the scholars in recent history who recognize a connection between the iconography of Pan and what became the Christian devil. The devil is modeled on Pan, not only Pan. The devil is kind of a syncretistic figure. You know, sometimes he has bat wings, he has characteristics of many animals, but underneath you can see the goat. So the devil has the horns and the pointed ears and the goatish beard, and the lower body is a goat and the cloven hoof. All you have to do is say cloven hoof and people go, oh, it's the devil. Well, that's the goat. That's the goat god Pan, who in Greek mythology was not evil, but was holy. That's our main point, that Pan, as a quite natural deity of the goat god, he is a god of he's a shepherd god, a god of the goats and the sheep and the whole business of shepherding and even fishing. This is how he shows up in the astrology imagery of Capricorn. did you ever wonder why that goat has a fish? You know, it's a goat on top and a fish on the bottom. What is that? You know, well, that comes from exactly, right out of Pan's mythology, because it's meant to represent a way of life. The way of life is shepherding the goats and the sheep, and you're kind of on the fringe of society when you're out there in the fields, with your goats and sheep. And also you enter into a little bit of hunting with your simple tools, rabbit hunting, but also fishing. Okay, so the goats are known across the world for their character, for their tough character. And what I learned in my research, it's kind of funny that we're urbanites in our modern world. We never even usually even come near the source of our food. We think the source of our food is the grocery store, right? So most moderns don't know there's a whole universe of meaning uh, um, uh, symbolized by the imagery in Greek myth that we are so far removed from, we don't even know anything about it. But if we were to go back in history, if we were to investigate that lifestyle, we would find out that there's a great difference between the sheep and the goats. Maybe we know it by reputation now, but as I say, we're so far removed from that. But the ancient shepherds certainly knew the difference. The sheep are obedient and the goats are not. So this is where I'm getting my theme of disobedience. The sheep kind of follow along a leader, and they go wherever the leader goes. So they're much easier to control. But the goat herds and the shepherds knew that the goats are ornery. The goats will not follow along with each other, and they're a little bit wild. They're kind of, as we say, liminal, meaning on a border between two realities. They are domesticated animals, of course, but they never fully domesticated. They remain kind of wild and a little bit uncontrollable. So, and they can eat anything, they can eat tin cans and so on, which didn't exist in ancient Greece. So they're ornery, they're tough. And what was so much fun for me, among other things in my research, I found my two kind of technical terms were ornery and horny. And both of those terms come from the word horn. So who has horns is ornery. So Pan comes to stand for then the wild and the natural world, with its behaviors, with its the struggle to survive on the part of all different animals and different groups, foraging, begetting, fighting, and lusting. You see, of course, all of the aspects of animality all together. As he gets, so he represents this primal ancient reality of goatish life, the untamable. Okay, what Jung is going to call the shadow, and I know we'll get into this. And then as time went on, as we move into the classical era in ancient Greece, the philosophical era in Athens, we're talking about the 6 to 500s and past BCE, before the Common Era. The philosophers did quite a number on Greek society, although regular people, didn't read the philosophers. It was an elite group that ever knew anything about the philosophers. But they certainly made a colossal impact on Western intellectual history. And one of the things the philosophers began to do in the 300s BCE was to, they became a little bit embarrassed, as it were, about their own mythic tradition. Do we really think that it's cloudy today because Zeus and Hera are having more marital problems? Did the lightning strike because Zeus has a pounding headache because Hera is bothering him again? This is sophisticated philosophers speaking about the nature of existence, Plato and Aristotle and so on. So they kind of grew out of it. They matured, as it were, and they no longer believe in the stories of the mythology of the gods of Mount Olympus. So in the philosophical era, the philosophers began to give kind of allegorical meanings to all the gods. When we invoke Athena, goddess of justice, what we mean is justice. When we speak about Aphrodite, we mean beauty. All right, so all the gods get reassessed and reevaluated and given philosophical qualities and identities. And so when they get around to Pan, well, what does he represent? So the philosophers used a kind of a linguistic trick, as it were, or a mechanism. The word Pan, the name of the god, is a homonym with another Greek word. A homonym, it's going to sound exactly the same, but it's two completely different meanings. Like we would say story and story in English, tell me a story. It's completely unrelated to my office is on the 5th story of the building, right? Although it's the identical word. Well, in Greek, they have diacritical marks, or what we call accents, on every word. And that's going to change the meaning of the word. So the name Pan comes from a conflation of the word paon. And so they merge it together as Pan. And then there were versions, I just love this, of the ancient name as Pon, his paon, Pan or Pon. Now I had, it's just a quick aside, but I had my precious little kitty that I named Pan when I was working on this book. And I just thought it was so cute. I thought I'll have to get another one and call him Pon. It's such a cute word. P with the omega N. So paon, Pan, related to all these words in the Greek language, in the Indo-European roots, for pasturing. It comes from pas and past and pasti and pati, pasture, pastor, pasturing, and the P shifts with an F in the Indo-European, pas and pus and pone and fus and food. So it comes from the same root as our word food. So this, it invokes a whole universe of meaning, as it were, the whole world of pasturing your animals, your herds, and nurturing and protecting them, right? So that had absolutely nothing to do with the other word Pan. Now the word Pan, his name, has a slanted accent over the A, whereas this other word Pan has a circular accent mark. Pan sounds the same, but the two accent marks make it two completely different words. Well, the second word Pan with the circular accent mark means in Greek all, everything. So that's at the root of our English words, panorama, to see all, or Pan-American or Pan-Hellenic. There are certain sites in ancient Greece, like the magnificent city of Delphi. They called it a Pan-Hellenic site, meaning all the Greek cities would send, representatives and temples to all the gods there. So Pan means all. Well, then when the philosophers came to allegorize Pan, the goat god of the flocks, they used this other word Pan, and they said, well, the god Pan represents Pan, all of what? All of physis, out of which we get our word physics or physical. It means in Greek nature, or the natural world. So Pan comes to represent all, Pan, the natural world, the physical world, and the world of embodiment, the physical body, the physical earth. Okay, now that's fine. Okay, we're allegorizing. That isn't what Pan was as a goat god, but that's what he came to be over time in classical Greece. Well, then the philosophers do their work, of course, and give their contributions to intellectual history as it evolves in the Western world. And Plato, I don't think anybody could underestimate the influence that Platonic thought has had on Western civilization altogether. And Plato and the Platonists were the primary influence, one of the primary influences on the development of Christianity. So Platonic thought fed right into Christianity. That's a complex field, but we can, unpack that if we get to that. So Plato, and then of course Aristotle also, his pupil, had an enormous, we could never underestimate the impact of Aristotelian thought on Western civilization and intellectual history either. But Plato, especially in his era, had the much greater influence. Aristotle's influence really started to come in much later. So Plato developed a concept of a perfect realm of pure thought, the realm of ideas or forms, as he called them, the archetype. They are transcendental. They exist in an eternal, unchanging, absolute, perfect realm. And our physical world is somehow derived from that, or a copy of that. We are a poor, imperfect copy of perfect ideas and perfect forms that exist in this realm of perfection. That's Platonism. Well, because Plato had such a huge impact, the status and valuation of the physical world, the earth, begins to be devalued enormously under the Platonic influence, until by the time we get to early Christianity, the physical world comes to be seen as a fallen place, riddled with demons. We have ruined God's beautiful creation with sin, with human sin, the sin of Adam and Eve. Okay. And so the status and valuation of the physical world, which then we're calling Pan's world, because Pan came to represent all of it, its trajectory just leads straight downward, gets worse and worse till it leads into hell. And then the Christian, and there are three references in the New Testament, all of them in the Gospel of John, to a figure that John calls the Lord of this world, or Prince of this world. And he means by that the devil. He means Satan. Well, this is how the steps occur. It's unconscious. So first you have Pan, the goat god, and then he's associated with the physical world altogether. And then the physical world gets devalued enormously, so that it's a ugly, fallen, Plato called it a prison. And we are the prisoners here. And what we want to do is escape. And then the Christian value system places their own terminology and imagery and values on top of that. And Plato's realm of perfect forms becomes, in the Christian imagination, their word, heaven. And then in Christianity, the concept is that we came from heaven somehow. Somehow that's our true home. And we're here in this fallen, sinful place, the physical world. And we're here to rise above our physical nature and not give into it. And we are in the world, but not of the world. And our main goal in this life is get out, seek salvation and follow Jesus back home. He can lead us home to heaven where we came from. So the status of the physical world gets devalued. And this is how Pan becomes, demonized into the devil. And this is how the devil comes to look like a goat god, until he comes to be viewed as the Lord or Prince of this world, namely Satan, the devil.
Yeah, very good.
Okay.
There's a lot that I actually want to go back to with what you just said. So we'll break a little bit of it down. One of the questions, I just want to go back to Pan just for a little bit and ask, how was Pan traditionally worshipped? Or where was he worshipped? Were there temples to Pan like there were to the other gods?
Okay, and it's a good, interesting question. We have sources, we have archaeology, and what we call, God, I'm forgetting the word, inscriptions all over Greece. Okay, ancient inscriptions, even found on rocks and so on. So there were open air shrines to Pan that were found everywhere. And Pan came to be associated with caves as well. Caves, it's so interesting. Caves are liminal. They're in this world, but they're the doorway into the underworld. And why do we get caves associated with Pan? Just as I said a little earlier, why do we get fish associated with the goat god? Because it's a lifestyle where you're herding your goats and you're fishing in the streams and so on. You're bringing home the bacon, as it were, although pigs are something else associated with a different goddess. So you're bringing home, the goats and the sheep. You're protecting your family and providing for your family. If you can't, fish can always be caught. You can always provide for the family. So what, in a similar way, fish that have no association with goats, in a similar way, caves come to be associated with Pan, because it's so interesting to have learned all this for us modern urbanites that know nothing about it. When you're out there and you're out there for months at a time with your herds, in the pasture land, well, the weather might get terrible, it might, cloudburst and terrible rain. What do you do with all your sheep and goats? You shelter them in caves or any kind of lean-to or some kind of natural formation that would protect the herds from the rain and so on, came to be sacred to Pan. Now, so you get your herds into the cave. So cave shrines were found all over ancient Greece, and he did not have many temples, structures that were built purposely by humans of a high sophisticated nature. And this is just so interesting. He's a rustic, rural god of the woods. And, in paganism, he is still worshipped all through the millennia. The worship of the old gods never ceased, but that went underground in what we might call the Christian centuries. So Pan, or the horned god of the woods, was always worshipped by pagans and still is to this day. And he's not evil. So he represents that primal, savage kind of realm of the woods. And when he gets incorporated into Athens in this classical era, when Athens has become so sophisticated and is producing the great works of civilization, they invented democracy, by the way. That was Athens in the 6th century BCE. They invented the court system. There's so much in our world that comes directly from not just Greece, but classical Athens that we take for granted. Well, we tell the story, the Greeks told the story of the Persian Wars. The Persians attack or try to attack Greece in the 490s BCE. And, they're on ships. So the people on the rim of the sea can see them. The Persians are coming. Here are all their ships. We can see them. So the Greeks had an athletic tradition. Right now, when we are recording this, we're into the first week of the Olympics, which is so exciting. Well, by the way, the Olympics were invented by ancient Greece, and the tradition of athleticism and the greatness and what an athlete can accomplish, all of it comes from ancient Greece. A certain town on the rim of by the sea, the people. This is a real story. Not just a myth, but real history. They could see the Persians coming on the sea, and this one little town wasn't going to be able to amass enough of an army to fight off the Persian Empire. So they had a runner, an athlete from this town, and they told him, run all across Greece, quick, and tell everyone, yell it out everywhere you go. The Persians are landing, send an army. All right, and he did. And that guy, you all know the town he came from. It's called
Olympia?
Marathon.
Oh, Parathon. Yeah.
Marathon.
Oh, Marathon.
So
Yes.
Marathon
Okay.
Run, which do they still have an event in the Olympics? It's a marathon. It came from a town on the edge of Greece, and it's a real event where this runner tried to warn the rest of Greece, and they did send armies in there, So the Greeks tell this story of Phidippides, who was the runner, the athlete, the marathon runner from Marathon, who runs everywhere, and he runs across the Peloponnese through Arcadia, which is a more backward sort of rural area, and he runs into Pan, and Pan, who lives there, is just kind of hanging out, and sees the runner going by, and he calls out, the runner says, hey, send an army, the Persians are landing, and he stops and has a kind of conversation with the god Pan. Now, in ancient Greece, if you ever run into a deity, boy, you better, show him some respect, show him some consideration. So Phidippides stops and talks to Pan, and Pan says, gee, I've been always friendly to the Athenians, and I'm a great supporter of Athens. How come they don't do anything for me? How come they don't even give me any honors, or remember me in their prayers or anything? I'm a god of Greece. I'm going to protect the Athenians too. So by the time Pheidippides gets back, of course, he tells this story how he met Pan in the woods of Arcadia on his run. And the Athenians immediately started worshiping Pan and giving shrines and, respect to Pan. And this is the part that's so interesting and why I bring it up. Because now, for the first time, they're going to build a temple or a worship place for Pan. And in classical, the height of civilization, the pinnacle of their classical civilization in Athens, they did not build a building for Pan. They knew that Pan is rustic and crude, as it were, animalistic, and he represents the natural world. So instead of a stately building, you have the Acropolis in Athens and the magnificent temple to the virgin goddess Athena. The word for virgin in Greek is Parthenos. So they built a temple for the virgin goddess, still standing, called the Parthenon. And it's a magnificent stately building. And then the Erechtheum and all the beautiful buildings on top of the Acropolis. Well, down on the side, down the hill of the Acropolis, they found an area that was undeveloped, and they made a grotto, like a cave grotto, and dedicated it to Pan. And this is the first real temple to Pan on the side of the Acropolis, a wild place. And they had the wisdom to think, keep him wild, represent him as he is, as a wild creature. So I had a student some years ago who put it so well. She called Pan, I like a drum roll when we're getting to something important. He's a crude, rude dude. So even the Athenians recognized his primal qualities and kept his worship place as a primal place of nature.
Very interesting, very interesting. And I think that this is going to lead us to, especially with the idea of the caves, to what I want to talk about next, which is Carl Jung. And but before we get there, I have one question in regards to the Platonic division that we get, this dualistic worldview of this sort of imperfect physical world and a perfect transcendental world. Pan, if I understand correctly, is the only one of the Greek gods to have died. Is that correct? And I was curious if this dualism that's created by Plato, is that what killed Pan?
Maybe indirectly, but we have a very strange story that I oriented my book around, and it tells of the death of Pan. And he's one of the only gods. It's ironic because he stands for the goats and he stands for survivability. He stands for the urgent, drastic struggle that animals in the wild enter into every day to survive, to find food and survive. So he represents survival, and he's one of the only gods said to have died. This story came from Plutarch, and it's our only reference to this story. Plutarch is a late writer. He's writing in the first century, BCE into the first century CE, Common Era. And he tells this strange story of a ship that was on its way through the Greek islands. It's the island of the Echinides, I think, and as the captain, the ship moves toward this island, it's dark, it's nighttime, it's quiet, and he hears a voice from the shoreline, and the voice, it's like a disembodied voice, and the voice calls out, "When you get to Paxi, tell them, if there's no wind when you get there, call out and tell them, Great Pan has died." And the captain doesn't know what to think about this. Captain is called Thamus. So there are scholars who tried to find a meaning in that story that Thamus was really Tammuz, who was the ancient Semitic god who died and rose. There are gods who had died. Dionysus died, but rose again. Persephone died, but rose again. But Pan is not described as resurrecting after dying. So that's the difference there. So the captain doesn't know what to do, and he's very wary. You don't just talk about the gods like that, you know. The Greeks were very reverential toward all their gods. So the ship comes toward this island of Paxi, and it's, you know, it's very quiet, no wind at all, you know, no weather. And so he said, I guess I better do what they told me to do, you know. And he calls out, great Pan has died. Homegas Pan techneke. I'm sorry, I'm not getting this right. Great Pan has died. And he heard that all the ship's company heard this enormous great wail of nature, like a great sigh, and sorrow like a scream or wail, as all of nature, Pan, all of nature died. And all the gods left the physical world, left nature, and nature has died with a great, you know, cry of sorrow. Now, Plutarch picks that up. His context was, why have all the oracles gone silent in his day? You know, there were oracle sites all around Greece, not just the Delphic oracle. And these were sites from the earth where there are geysers, you know, or gases that emerge from the earth and hissing sounds and so on. The Greeks thought, oh, that's the gods talking from the earth, the ancient goddess Gaia, or Gaia, you know, the earth goddess, giving us messages from the earth. So they set up these oracle sites and would ask questions. We're all familiar with that. So Plutarch has been asked, well, why are there no more oracles? Why don't the gods speak to us anymore from the ground? Well, Plato, a couple hundred years earlier than this, kind of helped to kill off nature, right? He killed off the physical world by saying it is a fallen place. It isn't even real. The real is transcendental. The realm of truth is, you must get out of this world and overcome your natural body and the natural world to get to the truth, which is beyond us. So that starts to devalue the earth. Well, by the time we're in the 1st century, people aren't going to the oracles anymore, and the oracles aren't speaking. And we have a very complex, you know, I'm skipping over a very complex field of many, many new religious forms springing up, and Gnosticism and so on. And one group was more anti-worldly than the next. So I've described it as a trajectory, a dystopian trajectory that comes into the field in intellectual history and religious history at this time. By dystopian, we mean, you know, anti-utopian. It's a dystopic world. It's a fallen prison of a place. We don't find the sacred here. The sacred has left. Well, symbolically, then all the gods left. Well, that story of Pan's death, Plutarch says, well, this is why he's giving an explanation. He's asked the question, why have all the oracles ceased? And he answers, you know, I think some of those gods that were speaking in the oracles have died. And they weren't entirely immortals to begin with. Some of them were nymphs of trees. And as we know, a tree can live for thousands of years. I think, isn't this true that the oldest still living beings on this earth are the sequoia, you know, redwood trees are among those trees. They're 6,000 years old and they're still alive. Isn't that amazing? So the nymph that lived in that tree, you know, is ancient, thousands of years old, but trees eventually do die, Plutarch says. And the goddess in the tree dies too. And that's why the oracles aren't speaking. And then he tells the story of Pan, the god of the earth, you know, the woods and the whole earth died. That's why the oracles aren't talking to us anymore. Well, then the early church father and church historian Eusebius picks up this story in the first, let's see, he's writing in the 300 to 400s CE. He picks up this strange story from Plutarch and he says, aha, let's look at this closely. When does Plutarch report that the god Pan has died? Because Plutarch put in there, in the era of Tiberius, our emperor, all the oracles went silent and the god Pan died. All of nature died. And so Eusebius picks this up. Aha, he says, it happened in the reign of Tiberius Caesar. That is the same time when our Lord Jesus Christ was had advented into this physical world, when God in his wisdom, came down and put himself in a body and walked in this earth. That's when it happened and not any other time. Isn't that interesting? Here's why the nature died. Here's why Pan was overcome and died, because Christ was in the world at the time. And Jesus exorcised all the demons from this earth. So then all the demons comes out in Greek as pandaimonia, which, by the way, was the subject, the title of my dissertation, Pandaimonia, the death of all the demons. So Pan, in the Christian author's words, Eusebius, was formally associated with demons, pandaimonia, and negativized, the demons were evil, and Jesus Christ has exorcised or chased them all away out of the earth. Okay? Mm-hmm. So there's this strange story of the death of Pan, which had no other reference.
Okay, very interesting. And it reminds me I know that in the biblical tradition, wilderness is quite often demonized. Yes. And, it's like that's where Adam and Eve were sent, yes. After they disobeyed God, was out into the wilderness. And that's where Jesus confronts Satan, or Satan confronts yes. Jesus, is in yes. the wilderness. And it was seen as this place of moral confusion and whatnot. Yeah, so it's very interesting. And I also see a little bit of irony in the sense that Jesus, the historical Jesus, was largely teaching to the peasants. He was out in the pasture lands, right? In many, yeah.
And he uses all the shepherding and goat herding imagery. The pasture and the lost sheep of Israel, and so on.
Right. Yeah, but there it's the lambs, not the goats.
Yeah, the lamb, right? So the Hebrews had practiced the scapegoating ritual, and that's a goat. That's all the sins of the society is the tribes put onto a goat, 2 goats. One goat sacrificed to God, and the other one receives all the sins and all the trouble and negativity and disease and pollution of the society. And they tied a red thread around its horn so they'd know if it ever came back. They didn't kill it. They pushed it out into the wilderness. And there go all our sins and all our problems. That's called scapegoating. So I have a section in my book where I talk about the spotless lamb led to the slaughter, Jesus. So it's the same formula, though. We're getting into Jung here, and Jung will see that quite differently. So I called him the scape lamb, the scapegoat and the scape lamb. And so it's just my funny little note here that I'm reading my text over and over and over, and your eyes kind of gloss over after a while. So I'd always read that scape lamb as space lamb. So I just have in my mind that he's a space lamb.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know one author is making an argument. He's referring to Jesus from outer space because of the cosmic Christ. So his book is, I think, something like Jesus from Outer Space.
Like an alien traveler?
I don't know. I haven't read the book. I've only heard bits of his argument, but it's focused on, Paul's version of Jesus, which is a different topic. So I think that maybe what we might want to do to flesh this out is take a look at Jung. And I know that probably most, if not all, of my listeners are familiar with Carl Jung. But I thought it might be helpful for the few who may not be, if we could introduce him a bit. And specifically, and I know this is a loaded question here, there's a lot to this, but I thought it would be important to explain some of the concepts that you use throughout the book, in particular, shadow, repression, projection, archetype, and complex, because those are all crucial to what you're doing.
Right. Okay. And I have something directly from Jung here. So Carl Jung was a Swiss psychoanalyst who worked with Freud in the early part of his career and was kind of like a protege to Sigmund Freud until they split. They had differences of opinion on many topics and had a bitter kind of split in the end. And Jung went off in his own direction and developed his own school of psychology, which we call analytic psychology, which others just call Jungian thought. And Jung really traveled from the Freudian basis. And eventually he came up with his own theory, kind of overall overarching theory of consciousness. Now, he worked as a 25-year-old, if you can imagine, as a intern in a Swiss, what they called insane asylum at the time, with psychotics, psychotics who are so far gone, as it were, that they can't really function in society. So they've been institutionalized. Well, he found it very, very hard to communicate with these people. And he was just thrown in to try to, find some kind of cure. He actually listened to the ramblings of the psychotics. And this was the first time, this is 1900, and this was his first introduction to a strange language. He called it the language that's native to the unconscious. He thought these psychotics are speaking straight out of the unconscious. And it seemed to him, he listened very closely to their imagery, and it would be disjointed, shift from here to there, with no connection, and bizarre imagery and so on that he would hear. And it seemed to him, it sounded most like the language in dreams. In our dreams, we might shift from here to there so suddenly, and strange, very bizarre things can happen in a dream. So he thought of this, and he wondered, well, what would the dreams of the psychotics be like? So he started to ask some of these psychotics, some that were more verbal, about their dreams. And their dreams were so amazing. The dream of the psychotic was something like, I see I'm out of something in my cupboard and I need to go to the store. So I go to the store, and in my dream, I'm going up and down the aisles of the store and putting items in my cart. And at the end, I pay for it all and come home and put it on the shelf, and I wake up. In other words, their dreams were logical, ordinary, sequential, not much happening, regular, ordinary life. And yet their waking life was dreamlike, as if they were in a dreamscape, bizarre imagery and strange things and so on. So Jung started to think, well, the psychotic is just the reverse of the norm. They are speaking out of the unconscious while awake. And then while asleep, they're in the rational side of the consciousness. And for the rest of us that aren't, institutionalized as psychotic, we are in our rational minds while we're awake, and we're in the manifestly irrational realm of the unconscious while asleep. And this isn't, wrong or something, diseased about it. It's just the reverse of the norm. So this is how he was first introduced to the strange language of the unconscious. And the more he investigated it, the more he thought it sounded like mythology. And he comes up with a whole theory that the language of the unconscious is the language of myth. And the worldwide mythology is its proponent, its expression. So we can read world mythology in all the religions of the world, and artistic expressions and so on, as the expressions directly from the unconscious. Then he found an amazing similarity across the world, and similarity in the ramblings of his psychotic patients and individuals' dreams and fantasies and so on. He saw the same motifs and imagery that we see in mythology around the world. So he comes up with a theory, what he calls the archetypal theory. He has two levels at work in Jungian thought always, a personal and a collective level, because he found this language to be spoken all around the world and all through history. Now, we in religious studies are in a position to do like the field work for the Jungian hypothesis, because we study religions all around the world. And we find indeed the same motifs and similar themes. It's always going to be different because that culture expresses it differently. But underneath is the skeletal form, right? Like all of us humans, we're all unique. We have completely unique fingertips of no one else in the world. And yet underneath, if you go down to our, foundation, our skeletal structure is identical in all people, more or less. So he finds the same concept in consciousness, that we have universal structures like a skeletal structure underneath in the unconscious, and yet we are all fleshed out, and each culture fleshes out the imagery in a unique way. So here's an example, the pyramids of ancient Egypt, and there was a interesting guy, Thor Heyerdahl, in the 1960s, who tried to prove that the ancient Egyptians could have made reed boats made out of the reeds, the papyrus reeds, and they could have sailed across the Atlantic and made the pyramids in Central America, right? That would be what we call cultural diffusion, that one culture dreams up all of this and spreads it to all the other cultures of the world. Jung thinks that's just exactly opposite. It's not, sure, cultural diffusion can happen. Well, of course, one society influences another. That happens all the time. But he's talking about something else, parallel development. The pyramids of Central America don't fit the timing. They were thousands of years later. So Jung will call the pyramid structure an archetype. It's a form that exists in consciousness. It pre-exists. And consciousness everywhere it expresses itself will come up with, an express pyramid forms. They're not identical, but underneath it's the same concept. So here I have a quick little quote from Jung about what an archetype is. He says, my thesis then, I'm quoting from Jung directly, is as follows. In addition to our immediate consciousness, which is of a thoroughly personal nature, there exists a second psychic system of collective, universal, and impersonal nature, which is identical in all individuals. The collective unconscious, he calls it, does not develop individually, but is inherited. It consists of pre-existent forms, the archetypes, which give definite form to psychic contents. So archetype, he gets that term from Greek philosophy. Arche means in Greek old and ancient and so on, archaic, but it also means original. The first words in the Bible, in the beginning, the Greek version of the Bible, the Septuagint, that word is arche, in the beginning, from the beginning. And the German is correlated with our word original. And the stuff that the philosophers were looking for. That is arche, original. And then typos is an impression. Like when you walk on the beach where the sand is wet, you leave an impression, your footprints. That's called those are called typoi, or a type, right? So you put it together, archetype, archaic typoi, or impressions, archaic or original impressions left on consciousness from the ongoing evolution of creatures on the earth. So we're going to find these archetypes everywhere, and they're all through religions all around the world.
All right, wonderful. And let's look then at the shadow, because I think that comes in. It's very important to consider that for Jung and Pan as well.
Right. Okay, so the shadow is an archetype. Now, where Jung worked with Freud. Now, Freud came up with his theory of personality, and Freud, some say this was his biggest, his greatest or best impact. He came up with his famous theory of the id, ego, and superego. Most people are familiar with that by this time. And it isn't necessarily that he was copying Plato, but Plato came up with a very similar breakdown of the personality. Plato called us humans tripartite. We have our reason in our head, and our passions in our chest, and our appetites down below in the lower part of our body. And that's animal. We're an animal in the lower parts of our body, our appetites. And of course, Plato, claimed we've got to negate the appetites, and rise above and lead with reason till our reason can be released from this prison house of our body and fly back homeward to the realm of forms. So go a couple thousand years from there to Freud, and he had the id, ego, superego. So what he meant by the id is the seething, the subconscious, Freud called it, and its resident is the id. When we're born, we're all id. It's the savage animal. It wants what it wants. The baby cries. There's no ethics involved. The id is driven by what he called the pleasure principle, to gain pleasure and avoid pain. Okay, and then the ego develops, and then the superego is the parental voice internalized. Okay, so Jung was exposed to these ideas. And eventually, when he develops his own philosophy, he came up with his own breakdown of the personality. And he thinks these are Jung's categories now. The ego, and Jung means something very similar to Freud. That's the ordering center of rationality, rational consciousness. It's lit up, okay, like you have a light bulb go on, and we say we shed light on something. That's our rational mind that looks with light with our eyes to examine things, rationality, ego self. And Jung imagines that the ego wears a mask in its, it's the very front, the way that we present ourselves to the world. He called it persona. The persona is completely manufactured. It's how you want to present yourself to the world. Your tattoos or your hair, your clothing, your business suit, however you want to present you. This is how you want the world to see you. Okay? And then that's the mask the ego wears. Beneath the ego, then, is a layer, I think there's a layer of the anima animus at the personal level in between the ego and the shadow. Anima and animus, this is an aspect of the personality we all will have. Jung brings this in the 1920s. Anima is the Latin word for soul, the translation of the Greek word psyche. I'm wearing my butterflies today, you all. The butterfly is symbolic. The butterfly in Greek, the word for butterfly is psyche, meaning soul. And what the butterfly undergoes, the transformation of metamorphosis, is a symbol for what the soul undergoes as we die to the small self and give rise to our great self, and the path of individuation, as Jung calls it. So he thinks that the anima, which is the Latin word for soul, is the feminine element in the psyche. And the animus is the masculine element. Okay, and the masculine and feminine are built into nature, but Jung, even in the 1920s, talked about it as a continuum, as a spectrum. And wherever an individual is on the spectrum, that's how they identify their gender and sexuality. But he felt that every female has an inner male, the animus, and every male has an inner female, the anima. And that's what we project outward into the world. We look for a mate that matches our inner unconscious model of our anima or animus. He says the masculine and feminine must be incorporated in, infused all through nature and all through our lives and through our consciousness. This is one thing he points out, that the models of deity in the Western world long ago suppressed the anima. There's no feminine in the divine, and it needs to be recovered. And then the anima or animus will lead directly into the shadow. So the reason Jung calls it the shadow is because he imagines it just behind the ego, the lit up center of the ego. So it's in the shadows, almost as if you shine a light outward. Well, if you stand right behind the light there, you're in the shadows. So that's why he calls it the shadow. The shadow then is the resident in the unconscious, and the full personification of the whole unconscious. The shadow is then the dark self, the ancient animal self. He meant something similar to what Freud meant by his id, the id. But the two of them have the opposite concept in mind. Freud thought the id, the ancient savage animal within all of us, has to be severely and strictly repressed if we expect to be civilized at all. Because if we want civilization, we're going to have to control our inner animal. Because if we just let it out, as animals in nature are all shadow or all id, they just, grab and kill and rape and steal and whatever. And that's how we'd be acting if we didn't suppress our id. Jung thinks just the opposite. But of course, the shadow, the ancient savage beast within, has to be controlled if we want to live in civilization, of course. But you don't repress it. Jung thinks any content of the consciousness at all that gets repressed is going to be very dangerous. Repression will just make it stronger. In any material that's repressed gets inflated. That is bigger, stronger, more insistent, more powerful. And it distorts into some kind of monstrous form. So when we're talking about the repression of the shadow at the individual and the collective level, one really great expression of this we find expressions in literature and in real life is the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, right? Isn't it Robert Louis Stevenson?
Yeah.
Um, Written in the 1890s, I think. Now, the degree to which Dr. Jekyll is civilized is the degree corresponds to the degree to which Mr. Hyde is uncivilized. So Dr. Jekyll is an exemplary member of his society, Britain, polite society, Victorian society. Okay, so but he's so civilized, he's like meek, and he's a doc. He makes a potion in his laboratory, and he drinks it. And out of the mild-mannered Dr. Jekyll, when we say mild, we mean repressed. Out of him, when he drinks the potion, comes Mr. Hyde. Hyde who hides. That's our hidden side, like the shadow is in the shadows behind the ego. So Hyde is the shadow self of Dr. Jekyll. Now, because Dr. Jekyll is so repressed, as British society is so repressed at that time, and not only Britain, and not only in the Victorian era, that is why the shadow within Dr. Jekyll is so out of control. He's been nursing a monster. And when you tap into it, Mr. Hyde comes out, and now you have a monster loose. So Mr. Hyde, you notice he's always depicted as bigger and stronger and more muscular than Dr. Jekyll. That's the sign of inflation. Here's the inflated shadow of Dr. Jekyll and of all society. So now Hyde is loose, and he has no scruples. He's a sociopath. He has no sympathy for anyone or anything. And he just rapes and pillages and murders and steals. He does all the things that we, have learned to control in our civilized society. He's out of control. Here's our model of a dangerously repressed consciousness, Dr. Jekyll, who's nursing a monster, Mr. Hyde, who's going to destroy society, civilization. Well, that story is written at the same time. Is so amazing that you have a real life example of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde in the contemporary figure of Jack the Ripper. Now, nobody knows. I don't think that case was ever solved, right? And there are rumors that he was a royal or associated with the royals or whatever. In regular daily life, he's probably a real civilized, perfect gentleman. And then he goes nuts, at night or whatever, and goes out ripping up prostitutes, severe, just horrendous crimes that he committed, savage, cruel, sadistic. And then he wrote to the police in the blood of his victims. Do you know that? He wrote postcards to the police. Here's my latest victim. You're reading her blood, Oh my God, it's such a extreme distortion of highly civilized Victorian life. Well, this is what's nursed by repressing the shadow so severely. Okay, so literature and real life show the expression of that dangerous dynamic. And that's just what we have with Pan, the old goat god, who represents a shadow because he's an animal. Okay, and the human connected with the animal shows the shadow side. He's a shadow figure. And he gets distorted and inflated to be much more powerful into the devil, which is a distorted form. So we have the persona and the ego, and then the anima animus and the shadow, although Jung thought the anima animus is a deep, deep structure, especially at the collective level. And then what Jung called the path of individuation, he notes, he does a lot with words and word origins. So he finds, you can find symbols and meanings of realities by looking closely at the words we use for it. So the word, he focuses on this word wholeness. And he notes that, and that's the goal of the Jungian system, psychologically for the individual and for this larger society, the collective. Our goal is to be whole. Okay, and he notes that the word whole in the Indo-European root is related to the words health, healthy, holy, halo, halography. Okay, all of these words, holistic. So health and healthy and holy are directly related to whole. So his goal is to create wholeness in the psyche. And you do that by combining the two opposites to create a condition of wholeness. So every female needs to incorporate her masculine side to create a condition of wholeness, etc. the ego needs to incorporate the shadow to create a condition of wholeness. That would be health. Okay, so if you're not whole, then you can't be healthy. So anything that's repressed isn't being incorporated, isn't being, his word is embraced. So that's going to lead to problems. So Jung posits there's always a psychological or intellectual ego term and a corresponding unconscious term or mythical term for the same thing. So his method for gaining health, moving his client, his patient toward health, is what he calls the path of individuation. The mythical term for it is the hero's journey. So the hero in myth represents the ego self. It's light, it's lit up. So it's sometimes called the solar hero. So here, I'll give you an example. So often in stories, the vehicle that we're traveling in, is round. It's a mandalic. It's the round shape or mandala, which shows up in religions all over and symbols and imagery all over the world, is a symbol of wholeness. So we're traveling, let's say, oh God, we could do it so easily in our imagination. We could just leap and travel to a galaxy far, far away. And we're traveling in this sacred vehicle. It's a hunk of junk, as we know, but it's sacred. It's the Millennium Falcon. Well, every little detail in that story is symbolic. Millennial, it's ancient of the ages, and it's a falcon. That's the sacred bird of ancient Egypt, etc. You see? And who's traveling? We're gonna find our guy, our hero, Luke Skywalker. He walks the sky. He's the solar hero. He's the ego self. And he's going to enter into a grand adventure. He's going to find, his trickster element. That's R2D2 is the trickster. This is entirely parallel to another story when Dorothy went to Oz. She was knocked unconscious and went to Oz. Well, Oz is the deep unconscious. Galaxy far, far away is the deep unconscious. So Dorothy is the ego figure there. It's her trickster figure, her embraced shadow, that's Toto, that gets her into all her trouble. Well, you see the exact parallel, and they're both farm kids that are not from that family. They're both raised by aunt and uncle, and we find out they're both royals. It's the same story. It's an archetype underneath, and there are 1,000 stories told on this same model. That's why Joseph Campbell called his text The Hero with 1,000 Faces. So we've got Luke Skywalker, whose little trickster aspect, R2D2, gets him into all the trouble he gets into and saves him. And he connects with the wise old man, Obi-Wan Kenobi. And they go and travel. They connect with the personal embraced shadow, Han Solo. He's solo. He's out for himself. He says, I'm not in this for your revolution, sweetheart, and I'm not in it for you, princess. I expect to be well paid. I'm in it for the money. And of course, she says to him the immortal lines, if money is all that you love, then that's what you will receive. So he's the embraced shadow self, the savage, the animal, the one that's out for himself, you see? And he brings with him the animal element of the psyche, Chewbacca, who's pure animal. We incorporate, we get them all together, just like Dorothy finds the scarecrow and the Tin Man and the lion. Here's her animal self. We incorporate them together and travel, and we're going to go find our anima figure now. That's Princess Leia, and she's going to lead directly to she's right in the grip of the great collective, distorted, inflated shadow figure, Darth Vader. Okay, so the journey of the hero's journey, what they're seeking is freedom for the galaxy. You always have a big goal. The hero has to get a boon, has to earn the boon or the gift, and bring it back to all humanity to share it. Your hero's journey isn't over until you share your gift with all humanity. Okay, so they do, and they reach all of them together on the ship. And the last scene of episode 6 is with all of them together, and even the dead ones have come back and they're shimmering, everyone's together. That's your image of wholeness. You have reached a condition of wholeness. Now, you've got to mess it up again if you want more stories. If you want a sequel, you can't stay in wholeness. But, Jung's goal for his clients was to reach wholeness, health. the hero's journey. So each of us, each of you out there listening to this, you're supposed to ask yourself, I'm on my hero's journey. This is also called the authentic life or the examined life. Socrates had said the unexamined life is not worth living. You ask yourself, am I living authentically? Look at the word that's embedded in the word authentic, author to author. Are you authoring your own path? Or are you doing what everyone expects you to do? Are you just living up to societal norms and then you're miserable because you're not living up to your potential or you're not doing what you want to do? Follow your bliss, said Joseph Campbell. Same thing as saying, get on your heroic path. Now, it's going to take heroic effort to make it through. That's why we call it hero's journey. It will take heroic effort. It will take death. What's called the nekia, the ego, has to sacrifice itself all the way into death and then rise again as the phoenix, as the new self, as the great self, the heroic self, as the hero returns. And Bilbo Baggins returns all the way with the ring to the Shire. And he says, and then he settles down, and Frodo too, he saved the whole Middle Earth from evil. And then he just comes back and sits in his chair again and watches TV. I know they don't have TV. Is that it? Is that, you go back to ordinary life? No, you have become the hero now. You have become the great self. So there's a wonderful scene at the very end where Bilbo Baggins is carried off, to the realm of the gods. And Arthur, at the end, when he dies, is carried on the ship by the triple goddess, to Avalon, the realm of the divine. This is called, in the mythology, apotheosis. The hero's journey is not completed until we each reach apotheosis. Apo into theos, divine, into the divine. We are rendered divine by our great quest and our great journey. But you're not done. You ask yourself out there, anyone listening to the podcast, what's my bliss? And Joseph Campbell said, so many people ask me, I want to follow my bliss, but I can't find my damn bliss. I don't know what my bliss is. And Joseph Campbell gave a really great answer. He said, try to identify your agony because your bliss will be in that. And it was sure true for me. My book that I struggled and finally got it out, it was agony. It was my agony, but it was also my bliss. The ecstasy and the agony are built in together. That's why it takes heroic effort to get through. So find your agony, identify your agony, and your bliss will be in that. But ask yourself now, what is my gift that I'm here to give to all the world? I'm here to share what I discovered and created. And you're not done till you come back and share it with the world. So there's a wonderful scene in the Indiana Jones movies, in the second one, where a rich guy hires Indy to go find the Holy Grail, the Grail that held the blood of Christ, which if you drink it, you're, reborn from having been dead. And this rich guy wants it for his collection on his mantelpiece at home. You don't own the Holy Grail that carried the blood of Christ, So Indy has a great line there. And he says, that belongs in a museum. That's something for all humanity to own or share or, be moved by. It doesn't belong to you. So if you went all through graduate school as I did, or you went through medical school or whatever it is, and they put you through hell, didn't they? Well, you don't get all the way to a degree in a medical degree, and then you just go home and watch TV with it. You put your degree on the wall and you never, do anything with it. That's not what it was for. It was for humanity. It was to save others from suffering. That's your gift. That's your great gift. If you can't find your gift, think about it. Did you have a child? There's your gift to the world. And they put you through hell, didn't it? How many parents would say, oh yeah, my kid put me through hell and back. It's my agony and my ecstasy. Okay, so this in the Jungian language is individuation, reaching wholeness and health. Okay. I know I'll talk too much.
Oh, no, that's okay. It's always very good to listen to you. You have such wisdom to impart and share. One of my favorite, I think, quotes from Jung is, how did he say it? I'd rather be whole than good.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
You know?
Oh, well, perfect. You can't be perfect because perfection would leave out the shadow. So
Right.
this was all leading to the concept of the shadow, the dark self, or the animal, savage, ancient self. Jung thinks we have to incorporate that. We have to embrace that. Just as Dorothy embraces the cowardly lion. You're not afraid of the lion. Look at the tarot card for strength. It's a girl with a garland of flowers guiding a lion. Here's the image of ego and shadow combined. Okay, so we have to incorporate the shadow. Now, my book is about the severe, what's my word? The severe repression of the shadow through the millennia. When Plato first split the cosmos and he said, this physical world is fallen and corrupt, and then the Christians came in and said, it's sinful, you got to get out of it. They split the holy and the true from the lived experience of everyday life, right? So the shadow, the savage self in the physical world has been severely and systematically repressed for millennia. So it's ill, it's sick. We've been nursing a monster in our consciousness because we don't allow the shadow to come to expression. So when it comes out after it's been repressed for millennia, it is much more powerful, all inflated and twisted and distorted into a monster. And this is why once it, erupts out of the psyche, it leaves violence and ugliness and horror in its wake. We today in our world are strangling, we're suffocating, we're being bludgeoned. I know I'm mixing my metaphors by a severely repressed shadow. This is what you get when you repress the shadow for millennia. Non-stop violence, gun violence, continual war everywhere in the world, sick, twisted, distorted sexuality, which has been repressed for millennia. Sexuality is all embraced in the shadow because it's savage, it's animal, it's the forces that nature put into us for our survival. You repress all that, you're going to get a world like we have now. Screaming rage, constant, toxic. I've heard the internet, the social media site, called the realm of toxic disinhibition. So much viciousness is spewed out in social media. Where is all this coming from? And look at all this angry rage and white male rage and all of this, and the gun violence, as I say, all of this is a result of having repressed the shadow, which is very powerful. This is exactly the wrong aspect of the psyche to repress, because it's going to come out as a monster. And that's what we are witnessing in our world. If I can just say quickly, I know I'm talking too much.
No.
Jung wrote an amazing set of articles on World War II, on the Holocaust. Now, the first one is in 1936. It's an article called Wotan. Wotan was a Germanic god. We get our days of the week from the Germanic gods. Wotan is Wednesday. Odin, Wotan, Woden, Wednesday. And Thor, of course, is their famous god. Of course, it's all over the place in the modern mythology of the Marvel universe and movies and so on. That's modern myth, science fiction and fantasies, modern myth. So Thor, of course, with his magnificent hammer, the god of the thunder, lightning. We get our word Thursday from Thor's day. Anyway, the gods of ancient Germany were repressed. The gods stand for archetypal forms then. Now, I don't want to go into the whole thing. I'm just trying to give an example. When Germany Christianized, like all en masse, Christianity didn't come from their culture. It wasn't authentic to them. And they were a warrior, proud warrior culture. And they were forced to kind of accept this external norm. And in the religion that they accepted, the model is mildness, turn the other cheek, love the enemy, peace that Jesus represented. Well, that didn't fit the Germanic consciousness or culture at all, which was a proud warrior culture. Well, then these gods just got repressed in the German consciousness. And then Jung points to, he started to see real danger warning signs from his German patients in as early as 1911, 1912. He called it the blonde beast. And we are seeing the blonde beast arising in our world now with the, angry white male syndrome.
Hmm.
And he, witnessed as a Swiss person, witnessed next door to the horror that developed, in Germany. So in 1936, he's on it. And he's saying this is extremely dangerous. The whole nation of Germany is in the grip of a collective psychosis, which I believe he would say about our culture today. You tap into the unconscious, which here's your swastika, which is an ancient Indian term, going in, the counterclockwise direction is into the unconscious. You move into the unconscious and you tap into the monster that's been created for millennia, and you release it, and out comes, an extremely dangerous monster, and the whole world was endangered then. So he writes this series of articles about this, Wotan, and then after the catastrophe in 1946, and you can just see he's just horrified, witnessing what happened. Well, what happened was a collective psychosis, and it had to do in part with the severe repression of the shadow. That's what I'm pointing to in my book, how we have to release Pan from the distorted guise of the devil, get that off him, just as toward the end of the episode 6, such a wonderful scene where Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader asked for it. It was his idea. Darth Vader says, "Help me take this mask off." And Luke Skywalker helps him remove the mask. That is, remove the heavy distortion of Darth Vader. And underneath we see Anakin Skywalker, a scarred, ruined person, but he's going to recover his true self.
Yeah, and I think that this is why I believe your book is so important. I am in complete agreement with you that our culture is very sick, and so much of it is based on repression for a variety of ways, all that you listed. But I also, one of my primary concerns is with our ecological crisis, and I think this is precisely where Pan is so important.
Yeah.
Because we have repressed that. We've repressed our animal nature. We've even, people have and I think it's unconscious. People will often, and I've had students do that, humans and animals.
Right.
And I always say, well, humans are animals.
Yeah, that's right.
And I am thinking also, what Thoreau had said is that in wildness is the preservation of the world.
See?
So we need that wildness. We need Pan. And I know we're getting close to the end of our time. So I did want to ask you this question. One of the things that I've been interested in is this sort of shifting dynamics, I guess, of religion in the United States. And the largest growing community has been those who identify as spiritual but not religious.
Yes.
And the numbers of Christians are going down, especially white Christians. I think that's down to something like 44%. And you end your book talking about this a little bit, where you provide an argument for something like a new form of Christianity. Perhaps you talk about the grandchild to Judaism and Christianity, or the rebirth of a kind of paganism.
Yeah.
And I see that, but also at the same time, that this is something that is going to erupt spontaneously from the unconscious.
It is, right.
And that we need this new archetype. And my question for you is, do you think that Pan is in the process of being reborn?
Indeed, I do. And that's what my book is about, and it's an invitation, to Pan to be reborn. And of course, through just as I end with the section called an urban myth, a new urban myth. Just as that story of when Pan died, a wail of sorrow arose from all of nature all at once, and the physical world died, is, emptied of the divine. Well, I'm calling for a revival, and I'm saying at the end, I can just hear it, I can hear the tunes and the hoof,
Mm,
marks of the goat god reviving. And maybe it starts in the woods, in nature, and the new wail is heard. Great Pan is revived, Pan
mm,
redivivus, great Pan lives again. And it would waft from the woods, and the natural world over, across the cities and the malls of America. You could be hearing it through the mall.
mm,
Great Pan is reborn, and he's reborn out of our heart and soul.
mhm.
What we need to do is take the distortion off the God and re-sacralize our world and our bodies and our sexuality and our consciousness, and can return from out of our heart and soul and be reborn again.
Yeah. And I think that it's what's required is a disobedience. I'm thinking in terms of like the Extinction Rebellion, that what we need is this sacred disobedience.
Right. And that's one of the elements. That's the ornery aspect of the goat, where the sheep is, follows along, and the goat is ornery. So I'm looking for. I have some printouts from my book here in front of me, but while I'm talking, it's hard to go find it,
Yeah.
in my text. But I have a little section there. I'm talking about the pastors
Mhm.
in the sanctimonious robes of the religious authorities for millennia have convinced us we are sheep, and we are wretches,
Mm.
and we are born in sin, and we are sinful beings that can't even save ourselves, and that we need to be saved from our own nature. We're stained, we're sinful. And they have used, and we have bought into it for thousands of years, we as a collective whole, giving them our own permission for them to fleece us. You know, the pastors in their sanctimonious robes are fleecing us sheep and pulling the wool over our eyes. See all of my sheep analogies. We have been too much following the sheep, you know, to the slaughter, all the way to the slaughter, all the way to our own destruction. We need to get some goat energy. We need to get ornery. We need to revive our native sacred disobedience. And by that, I mean dissent. I mean, the disobedience is the wellspring of our whole democracy, by the way. Dissent might be our most prized possession in a democracy. You have to be free to dissent and disobey the norms, of society, especially if they're sick, if they're unhealthy and unwhole. Okay,
Yeah.
so we got to revive our sacred disobedience. I refer at the end to Prometheus as well. He's another
Mm.
model of sacred disobedience. He disobeyed Zeus and gave humanity the greatest gift of fire. And he's been punished for it through all of the eons of time. But we honor Prometheus. Where would we be without the gift of fire? Where would we be without disobedience? For 1,000 years in the medieval era, people just went along, and there wasn't a lot of generational difference. I always say, and so nothing changed. It was a static, stagnant society until the Renaissance, until things started to open up again. Whenever you have a generational difference, the kids don't want to do what the parents want. The kids are, rebellious. That rebellious adolescent deal, right? I always say, oh, that's sacred. That they have to. They're supposed to rebel, no matter what they're rebelling against. Don't worry about it. But this is healthy for the youth to rebel against the norms of society which they are inheriting. If they didn't rebel, things would never change.
Yeah, I think that that's exactly what we need right now, to recognize our animal natures, to
Hey,
rebel, to listen to, to nod to that pandemonia and the daemon, to listen to our inner spirit
yeah.
in that voice.
Mhm.
All right. Well, Sharon Coggan, it's been a delight speaking with you. How can people find out more about you or reach you if they have any questions?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm inviting people, if you heard this, whether you agree with me or disagree with me, Sure. Contact me. You can. I'm happy to have you email me. My email is Sharon SHARON .Coggan COGGAN at UC Denver, all one word, UCDENVER.edu, University of Colorado Denver .edu. And sure, I welcome. I don't know if I'm going to be welcoming all the disagreement, but that's okay. That's disobedience. You can dissent with what I've said. Hey, it's in the spirit of the subject here. But I very much invite your commentary, and thank you for listening to me. I didn't mean to go on too long.
Oh no, it wasn't too long. I'm just mindful of the time because I could speak to you all afternoon.
Talk for days.
Yeah, yeah.
Look forward
So
for you to get my book and read my book. It's fun and exciting. And let's just end with praising the Lord Pan and
yes.
inviting his return.
Yes, I didn't tell you this, but that's what I did before sitting down and logging into Zoom. Is I have some pan incense,
Oh, great.
and so I burned the pan incense and read the Orphic hymn to Pan.
Oh, fabulous. Isn't
Yeah.
that perfect?
Yeah, so I thought that was the perfect way to invoke Pan and to begin this conversation.
Well, I thank you so much, Nick. And I so much appreciate your giving me this opportunity. And thanks to all of you for listening.
Okay, well, thank you again, Sharon.
Thank you.
All right. And that's a wrap on episode 8 of Rebel Spirit Radio. Thank you so much for listening. I've included links in the show notes to where you can purchase Sharon's book, Sacred Disobedience. She tells me that the paperback version will be published soon. I've also included her contact information. If you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to give it a positive review on whatever platform you use to listen to podcasts. Your reviews really do help. And please consider subscribing. For those viewing on YouTube, please get this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you will be informed when I upload new content. For the time being, I'll be releasing episodes every other week with the goal of releasing them every week in the near future. I'm also working on creating additional video content for the YouTube channel, including book reviews, educational videos on topics concerning spirituality, the history of religion, and the religious response to the climate crisis. If you would like to support my work in creating free and credible material on YouTube, please consider making a one-time donation via PayPal. You can find the link in the show notes. Your support makes this podcast possible. I'm Nick Mather, and you've been listening to Rebel Spirit Radio. Until next time, may you be in peace and flourish in all possible ways.